In the late 1990s, the United States celebrated the beginnings of a booming economy. They celebrated the low unemployment, the good credit, the rising home prices. I remember it well. People could get credit so easily, they were buying ever bigger homes. And sometimes they would even check your income. And those who had existing homes, they would refinance it and add additions to it. And some people were so fortunate that they could afford a vacation home. And there were extravagant vacations, and it was a wonderful, wonderful, and all of the politicians and all of the economists talked about how wonderful the economy was doing. And here's the thing. We had come to believe that prosperity and abundance were the natural state of things, and the United States was the epitome of it. Even the church got in on the party, taking advantage of the easy credit and the extra income for refinances to do all kinds of things. Church and Wall Street became indistinguishable in the approach to the economy. Indistinguishable. Such that even they seemed to act the same when it came to indifference to those who were left behind. And that is the rub. As much peace and prosperity we were enjoying, there were people who were left behind, a great many people who could not enjoy the prosperity. And the prevailing theology of that time appeared to sanction overwhelming prosperity and abundance, but had little to say about justice and righteousness, had little to say about the people who would never enjoy that prosperity. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't leave here thinking that the pastor doesn't like prosperity. But the issue is not about whether we should enjoy prosperity and abundance we have. I don't think that's ever the issue. Rather, the matter is whether these things, this prosperity, this abundance, distract us from seeing the injustice and oppression it takes to get it. The issue may be that we run the risk of allowing our love of prosperity and our anticipation of this prosperity to cause us to forego partnering with God in creating a just and righteous society. Now, if I'm being a party pooper about how well things are going, I want you to imagine what they must have felt about Amos. Boy, when they saw him coming, they said, that's the most annoying man I've ever met in my life. Oh, they couldn't stand Amos. They even told him, get him out of here. He's ruining our good time. You see, Israel was going through a wonderful time. Things were great for Israel at this point. When Amos came running and talking and prophesying, Israel was prosperous and enjoying such great abundance. I mean, there was peace and prosperity everywhere. There were no wars. There were no countries that were threatening Israel. You see, Israel was surrounded by these big, powerful nations, and none of them was bothering Israel. So things were going well. People were getting rich. They were acquiring land and additional property, and they were adding rooms to their residences. They were buying vacation homes. And if you think I'm just making this up, read the whole book of Amos. You would think that there was a reporter from today who wrote it. But things were going well. And the worship spaces were full of people and money. Oh, yes. Filled with people and money. Worship was raucous and joyous. And the offerings were regular and plentiful. Things were going well. and it was going so well for them, they said, you know what? This is exactly what God ordained for us. We're supposed to be prosperous. God promised it, and now we have it. And who are you, Amos, to tell us not to enjoy it? Israel comforted itself with the idea that if things were going so well, God was behind it all, and God sanctioned it all. But here's the thing, despite all of that peace and prosperity, Israel was unhealthy. As with all societies who were experiencing such prosperity, Israel also had within her borders a great many people who were poor and who would not enjoy the benefits of a growing, prosperous society. And even though the nation appeared successful and life was good for some, Israel was plagued by a social and spiritual sickness. Injustice, unrighteousness. How can Israel be spiritually sick, you ask? These are the covenant people of God. These are the people God brought out of bondage. It is their peace and prosperity to be enjoyed because God started all. God heard their cries. God saw their misery when they were in bondage and saved them and put them in a good land. God was there in the wilderness, feeding them when they were suffering. These are the people that God chose. How could they be spiritually sick? These are the people for whom God rose up a wise and great king. And these were the people that God gave God's commandment to love God with all their heart and to take care of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And yet, in their enjoyment of peace and prosperity, they forgot the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. They forgot the people who need it the most. They refused to make things right for the least of these. They gained their abundance by exploiting the labor of the poor and refusing to share the very abundance they used them to get. And the prophet Amos saw it. The prophet Amos saw what was going on with the poor and the powerless. He saw the ones who had to work the land, the ones who had to pay the high rents, the ones who had to serve the wealthy. He saw the ones who could not afford the luxuries that came with wealth. And even those who had the courage enough to challenge the system. Amos saw that the government was not on their side. The courts were not on their side. The powerful refused to make things right for the poor, to make possible for them to enjoy the benefits of abundance. And so Amos concluded that justice had become like poison, and righteousness had become like a bitter herb. In other words, Israel does not do justice. Israel does not share righteousness. And so Amos prophesied that God was coming to judge. Oh, it must have sounded strange. We're doing so well. Why would God judge us? But Israel, so God is coming to judge you because you failed to do justice and righteousness. And of all the nations, now by the way, Amos said this to all the nations. Amos told all the nations that you're in trouble because you do not do justice and righteousness. But Israel should have known better. You ought to know better, Israel. You have a special relationship with God, so there should be no excuse. So Amos indicts them as hypocrites. He slams their worship and their spiritual life. Uh-oh. I told you the worship was good. But Amos said, no. Your worship, it's hollow. It doesn't mean anything. You see, all the feasts they celebrated, the solemn assemblies for which they gathered, the burnt and grain and peace offerings they made, the songs and music they made, all of that was done in recognition and reenactment of the justice and righteousness of God. So how dare you sing and pray and give offerings and not do righteousness and justice the way God did for you? And so then it gets real serious because he's got to make them understand. And in God's own voice, Amos says, I hate your worship. I hate it. I don't want your offerings. Your music, it's like noise. I don't want it. You're hypocrites. And so their assemblies, their offerings, and their music don't reflect how they act in the world. They sing these wonderful songs, but it doesn't show what God has given them. How can they make it right? How can they make it right? Live the life you sing about. Oh, you didn't hear me. Live the life you sing about. We are called to act with justice. We are called to love tenderly. We are called to serve one another and to walk humbly with God. Are we living the life we sing about? That's what Amos told him. What can we do, Amos, to make it right? Live the life you sing about. Live the life you pray about. Live the life you make off. He said, let righteousness flow like an ever-flowing stream. An ever-flowing stream never runs out. Even if you don't need it, when you come back, there it is. That's how righteousness should be. That's how abundance should be. Even if you don't need the abundance right now, the very day that you need it, you shouldn't have to worry that it's not there. It should be there waiting on you. That's the world that God dreamt for Israel. Goodness and abundance should never stop, and certainly should not be only for those who are most powerful or for the 1%. Israel is called to live the life it sings about. Israel is called to reveal the abundance it enjoys to all within the community. Israel is called to make the justice that God gave them available and a reality to everybody who comes. Now we are a people of faith who live in the most powerful nation in the world, and arguably the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And yet, rarely do we pause to consider what words God roars in our midst. That's what Amos said. God roars like a lion. You are enjoying prosperity and abundance, and you don't hear. God is screaming. God is roaring like a lion, trying to get your attention. But rarely do we pause to consider what God is roaring when things are going so well. And in our context of empire, peace, and prosperity, we are more apt to hear from the faithful about God's silence in the midst of suffering. Or they say that we hear God's wrath, not against us, but against those out there. That's what we hear faithful people talking about. God is mad at y'all, but not us. God is mad at those immigrants, but not us. God is mad at the Muslims, but not us. God's wrath, oh, I've heard it many times. God's wrath is going to fall on you LGBTQ people, but not us. That's the voice we hear. That's when you hear someone talking about God roaring, that's all we hear. But perhaps, we are confusing God's silence or God's wrath against others with our own unwillingness to hear God's roar for us to come back. To hear God's roar for us to do justice. To hear God's roar to us to do righteousness. And so in the midst of our prosperity and our overwhelming power and privilege, are we willing to welcome God's roar, to let justice roll like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream? Are we living the life we sing about? Are we sharing the abundance and prosperity we testify is a demonstration of God's generosity? Are we manifesting in the world the justice and righteousness we proclaim in our songs and in our prayers? I'm telling you right now, though, I do not want God to hate our worship. I do not want God to turn God's face away from our prayers and our praises. I do not want God to stop showing up in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the cup. I do not want God to reject our offerings that come from just sort of grateful hearts. I do not want God to stop listening to that beautiful music and that beautiful singing. I want God to embrace it all. I want God to take it all in. I want God to know that we are serious about justice and righteousness because we have benefited from it. So I hope our witness in the world will reflect everything we say, every prayer we make, every song we sing. I hope that everything that we do, I hope our coming to the table will be a testimony that goes out there and bring liberation to everybody else. I hope that everything we do here does not stop at that door, but that we take it out and let the world get some small measure of the love and grace that we know to be true in our lives. I hope that we understand that the injustice and oppression that plague our political, economic, and religious life is an opportunity for us to let God's roar shatter it. I hope that we don't ever accommodate ourselves to the exploitation and the indifference to those who will not enjoy the prosperity that some of us may enjoy. When I work in politics, on just about every speech, we have to write somewhere in the speech about how wonderful a country we have. In every speech, we have to talk about how good the economy was, and then we will pivot and say, when it's not so good, oh, these things are going on, but we are strong. Always reinforcing the notion that peace and prosperity is our natural state. And yet, somehow, every time need was presented to those politicians, every time we saw suffering in the form of poverty and the need for housing and health care, we weren't prosperous enough to give it. Every time we saw the human needs for food and welfare just coming, the requests and the need, the reporters would report what goes on, but every time, somehow, all of that talk about the prosperity we enjoy just wasn't enough to do justice. You've just heard it recently. They've been talking about all these tax cuts and this. We're going to do these tax cuts, and I'm waiting for someone to say, and we have enough. We have enough to take care of God's children. Oh, I know what you're going to say, but that's for the politicians. Stick to church, Pastor DeWayne. But I want to live the life I sing about. I want justice and righteousness to be the order of the day. And if I can't depend on politicians or economists to do it, I'm going to learn how to be as annoying as Amos is and let justice roll.